The courtroom buzzed with hushed murmurs as Darren Cole stood at the defendant's table, gripping a worn briefcase. His face was calm, but the intensity in his eyes was undeniable. Across the room, Judge William Crawford, an older white man with thinning gray hair and a dismissive smirk, barely glanced at the paperwork Darren had just submitted. The judge chuckled, shaking his head as he leaned back in his chair. "Representing yourself against Lancaster and Harrington? Son, this will be over before lunch." Seated at the prosecution's table, Ethan Lancaster, a high-powered attorney with an expensive suit and a smug expression, leaned back, arms crossed. He exchanged a knowing look with his junior associates, his confidence bordering on arrogance. Darren remained unshaken. He met the judge's gaze and responded, his voice steady and unwavering. "Over? Judge, we're just getting started." With that, he snapped open his briefcase, revealing stacks of documents and a USB drive. The weight of the moment settled over the courtroom. How could a self-taught man possibly take on a powerhouse law firm? And how did it all come to this moment? Darren Cole was just another overworked son trying to keep his family afloat. His mother, Angela Cole, had spent decades working as a nurse until severe arthritis and a heart condition forced her into early retirement. Darren had once been a promising law student at Brookdale State Law School, but when his father passed away suddenly, he dropped out to support his mother. He worked 2 part-time jobs, one as a delivery driver, the other as a bookstore clerk, just to keep the lights on. The law books he once pored over now sat gathering dust on his nightstand. Then, the eviction notice arrived. It was a cold Wednesday morning in late October when Darren found the envelope crumpled beneath the welcome mat as he returned home from an early morning shift. The bold red letters across the page sent a shock through his system. Final notice. Eviction date: December 5th. His heart pounded in his chest. He sprinted inside, gripping the paper so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Mom," he called, finding Angela in the kitchen, slowly stirring a pot of oatmeal. The gentle smile on her face faded the moment she saw his expression. "What is it, baby?" she asked, her voice already trembling. Darren hesitated before placing the notice on the counter. Angela's hand flew to her chest as she sank into a chair, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. "But I've been paying. I sent the last check 2 weeks ago." Darren clenched his jaw. "I'll figure this out." He drove straight to Summit Trust Bank, the institution that held their mortgage. The branch manager, Linda McFarland, a middle-aged woman with an icy demeanor and manicured nails, barely glanced at the eviction notice before smirking. "Missed payments," she said coolly, tapping her fingers on the desk. "We don't make exceptions for sob stories." Darren's frustration simmered beneath the surface. "My mom didn't miss payments. She sent the check. I need to see the transaction history." Linda let out an exaggerated sigh, clicking through her computer screen. After a moment, she swiveled the monitor toward him. There it was. Payment returned. Insufficient funds. Darren's chest tightened. That was impossible. He knew his mother had enough money in her account. Linda leaned in, her voice dripping with condescension. Maybe she forgot to budget for luxuries, like, food. Darren's fists clenched. He knew better than to argue with someone like her. Without another word, he grabbed the eviction notice and stormed out, his pulse pounding in his ears. His next stop was the local legal aid office, where he met Trent Parker, a young, overworked paralegal who looked barely older than Darren himself. Trent skimmed through the documents and sighed. "Sorry, man. Foreclosure laws are tricky, and we're swamped. Without a lawyer, it's a long shot." Darren's frustration boiled over. "So the bank can just lie, and we have to take it?" Trent shrugged, already reaching for another case file. "That's the system." Defeated, Darren drove home, his mind racing. He walked through the door to find his mother sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by old family photographs. She held a faded picture from Darren's 5th birthday, his father standing tall, holding Darren on his shoulders, while Angela beamed from the porch. The same porch that was about to be taken away from them. Angela's eyes glistened with tears as she whispered, "I failed you." Darren knelt beside her, shaking his head. "No, Mom. You didn't fail me. The system failed us." He looked around their home, the only home he had ever known, and clenched his fists. "And I'm not letting them take it without a fight." That night, Darren dusted off his old law books, spread them across the dining table, and opened his laptop. He didn't know it yet, but he was about to step into a battle that would test every ounce of his strength and expose a corruption far deeper than he ever imagined. For the next 2 weeks, Darren barely slept. His days were spent juggling shifts, but his nights belonged to foreclosure law. His dining table became his war room, stacks of legal textbooks, printouts of foreclosure statutes, a battered laptop running on borrowed time. The smell of stale coffee lingered in the air as he flipped through another case study, eyes bloodshot but determined. This wasn't just about a house. It was about his mother's dignity, the memories held within those walls, and the injustice they were being forced to endure. Then, late one night, Darren stumbled upon something odd. The loan modification documents had 2 different dates for the same signature. And one of those dates? It was the day Angela Cole had been in surgery, a day when she was under anesthesia and physically incapable of signing a legal document. Darren's heart pounded as he triple-checked hospital records and transaction logs. This wasn't just negligence. This smelled like fraud. And now, he had proof. Darren Cole sat in silence, gripping the printout from the state notary office so tightly that the paper crumpled in his hands. His mother's loan modification had been notarized weeks after the notary's license expired, a clear case of fraud. His hands shook as he spread out the documents across the dining table. His eviction notice, the forged signatures, the court transcript where Judge Crawford dismissed his claims without a second glance, it all painted the same picture. The system wasn't just failing him. It was actively working against him. His phone buzzed. Sofia Alvarez. He answered immediately. "Tell me you found something." Her voice came through, urgent and breathless. "Darren, this goes deeper than we thought. I spoke to a whistleblower inside Summit Trust Bank. They've been targeting Black and Latino homeowners for years, fast-tracking foreclosures, losing payments, and even forging documents like your mom's." Darren gritted his teeth. "And Crawford?" Sofia hesitated. "He's in on it. I found financial records. He owns shares in a real estate development firm that buys foreclosed homes at a fraction of their value. Every case he rules in favor of the bank? He profits." Darren closed his eyes. Everything made sense now. The mocking smirks from Ethan Lancaster, the judge's refusal to acknowledge evidence, the disregard for due process, it was all by design. This wasn't negligence. It was organized corruption. Darren inhaled deeply, his mind racing. "If we prove this, we don't just save my mother's house. We take them all down." The next morning, Darren arrived at the county clerk's office to file an emergency motion. He slid the state notary report across the counter, locking eyes with the clerk, a middle-aged man with tired eyes. "I need this motion filed immediately." The clerk barely glanced at the papers before shaking his head. "Judge Crawford already ruled on your case. There's nothing I can do." Darren leaned forward. "So, you're telling me a judge can ignore proof of fraud?" The clerk sighed, lowering his voice. "Look, Crawford isn't someone you challenge lightly. You sure you want to do this?" Darren's jaw tightened. "I don't have a choice." The clerk hesitated, then stamped the motion. "I'll file it, but don't expect a miracle." That night, Darren was reviewing case files when his phone rang. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. "Hello," gravelly voice whispered. "Back down, Cole. Walk away before you lose more than a house." A click, then silence. Darren's stomach turned cold. They were watching him. And they were ready to destroy him if he didn't stop. The next morning, Darren left early to visit his mother in the hospital. She was awake, smiling faintly as she sipped her tea. "You look tired, baby," she murmured. "Are you taking care of yourself?" Darren forced a smile. "I'm fine, Mom." He couldn't tell her the truth. He couldn't tell her that their fight for justice had become a war. As he sat beside her, his phone vibrated again. Sophia. He stepped into the hallway before answering. "Darren, something's wrong. They know we're digging." A sense of dread clawed at his chest. "What do you mean?" "I got home and my apartment was broken into." Darren's blood ran cold. "Are you okay?" "Yeah, but they trashed everything. My laptop, my hard drives, gone. They weren't looking for valuables. They were looking for our research." His hands balled into fists. This wasn't just intimidation. This was a declaration of war. Darren sat in his car outside the hospital, gripping the steering wheel. His mother's eviction date was just days away, and now he was running out of time. The system was closing ranks. But Darren had one last move to play. He called Sophia. "They want us scared. They want us quiet. But they made a mistake." Sophia exhaled. "What are you thinking?" Darren's voice was steady. "We set a trap." Silence. Then Sophia's voice, sharp with interest. "Go on." Darren laid it out. He'd visit Ethan Lancaster's office, pretend to negotiate, act like he was willing to walk away. But he'd be recording everything. "If they think they've won, they'll slip up," Darren said. "And when they do, we'll have everything we need to take them down." Sophia let out a slow breath. "That's risky." Darren nodded, staring at the city skyline through his windshield. So is doing nothing. For too long, this system had preyed on people like him, expecting them to fold, expecting them to give up. But they didn't know Darren Cole. They didn't know that he never backed down from a fight. Darren Cole stared at the message on the wall, bright red letters spelling out a clear threat. "Stay down." His heart pounded as he took in the destruction around him. His laptop, smashed. His documents, torn apart. His home, violated. This wasn't just about intimidation anymore. This was a direct warning. He clenched his fists, rage boiling beneath his skin. They wanted him scared. They wanted him silent. But they just made a mistake. He grabbed his phone and dialed 911, knowing it was probably useless. The line rang twice before a bored voice answered. "County Dispatch, what's your emergency?" Darren forced himself to stay calm. "My apartment was broken into. My legal files were destroyed, and there's a threatening message on my wall. I need officers here now." The operator barely reacted. "Are you in danger right now, sir?" Darren glanced at the shattered remains of his front door. "I don't know." A long pause. "We'll send someone when available." The line went dead. Darren lowered the phone, his knuckles white. They weren't coming. 20 minutes later, a single squad car rolled up outside. A middle-aged cop with a beer belly and mirrored sunglasses stepped out, lazily scanning the wreckage. "Looks like a break-in," he muttered, scribbling in a notepad. Darren ground his teeth. "No kidding. What are you gonna do about it?" The officer shrugged. "No cameras, no witnesses. Probably just some punks looking for cash." Darren stepped closer, barely containing his frustration. This wasn't random. I'm fighting an illegal foreclosure case. And this is retaliation. The cop finally looked at him, a slow smirk forming. That so? He flipped his notebook closed. Then maybe you should stop poking around places you don't belong. Darren felt his pulse spike. Excuse me? The officer tapped his badge. Just some friendly advice. You stir up trouble, don't be surprised when it comes knocking. Darren's blood ran cold. The system wasn't just ignoring him. It was protecting the people trying to destroy him. After the cop left, Darren sat in the wreckage of his apartment, hands gripping his knees. The eviction deadline was days away. His mother was still in the hospital. And now, he was being hunted. His phone buzzed. Sophia. Darren, she said, her voice tight. I don't want to freak you out, but you need to see this. A photo popped up on his screen, his mother's hospital room window, taken from outside. His stomach turned. They weren't just coming for him. They were coming for his mother. Darren took a slow breath, forcing his emotions down. He wasn't walking away. It was time to go on the offensive. Darren Cole jolted awake, his pulse hammering in his ears. The acrid scent of smoke invaded his nostrils before he even registered the flickering orange glow creeping beneath the apartment door. Sophia, he shouted, scrambling to his feet. Naomi Brooks was already up, coughing as she yanked open the window, the night air rushing in. Darren, we have to go, now. The flames licked hungrily at the doorframe, smoke thickening with each passing second. Darren grabbed the hard drive from Naomi's desk, the only backup of their evidence, before rushing toward the fire escape. Just as they climbed through the window, the front door burst open. Through the smoke, Darren barely made out the shadowy figure of a man stepping inside, a baseball bat gripped in his hand. They sent someone, Naomi gasped, her eyes wide with fear. Darren didn't wait to find out what came next. He grabbed Naomi's wrist and pulled her down the fire escape. Metal groaned under their weight as they reached the alley below. They sprinted into the darkness just as an explosion tore through the apartment behind them, the gas line. A thunderous boom sent a shockwave through the night, flames bursting from the windows. Darren shielded Naomi as debris rained down around them. They didn't stop running until they reached the end of the block. Gasping for breath, Naomi clutched his arm. That wasn't just a warning, Darren. They tried to kill us. He didn't respond. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Ethan Lancaster, Judge William Crawford, and Summit Trust Bank had escalated from intimidation to attempted murder. The system wasn't just protecting corruption, it was willing to bury anyone who threatened to expose it. The next morning, Darren stood outside what was left of Naomi's apartment, his fists clenched. Fire trucks still lined the street, the charred remains of the building smoldering in the daylight. An officer, the same one who had dismissed Darren's break-in report, stood off to the side talking to a fire marshal. When Darren approached, the officer barely spared him a glance. "Electrical fire," he muttered, scribbling in his notepad. Darren's eyes narrowed. "That's bullshit." The officer exhaled sharply, looking irritated. "Listen, kid, I get it. You're having a rough week. But unless you have proof someone set that fire, this is an accident." Naomi stepped up beside Darren, phone raised, already recording. "Are you saying you're refusing to investigate a suspected arson case involving a journalist and a whistleblower?" The officer tensed. "I didn't say that." "You implied it," Naomi shot back. "And I'll be sure to include that in my report." The officer's jaw tightened. "You people don't know when to quit, do you?" He turned and walked away. Darren let out a slow breath. "They're covering for them. Again." Naomi didn't respond. She didn't have to. They both knew the truth. That evening, Darren sat on the hood of Naomi's old car in a deserted parking lot on the edge of Brookdale. Naomi leaned against the passenger side, scrolling through her phone. "Your mom's eviction is still scheduled for tomorrow," she said quietly. Darren's hands curled into fists. He had fought with everything he had. He had the evidence. He had the confession. He had the damn fire that nearly killed them. And still, the system refused to listen. "The state attorney's office is stalling," Naomi continued. "Mitchell is trying, but he says he's hitting walls. Someone's pulling strings to keep this buried." Darren exhaled sharply. "Then we take it higher." Naomi looked up. "What do you mean?" Darren sat forward, his eyes blazing with resolve. "We go public. Bigger than just local media. We get national coverage. We put their corruption in front of the entire country." Naomi hesitated. "Darren, if we do that, we won't be able to stop it. Once this story is out there, they'll come at you with everything they have." "They already tried to kill us," Darren reminded her. "I don't care anymore. I'm not letting them win." Naomi studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Then let's burn them down first." The next morning, just as sheriff's deputies arrived at Angela Cole's home to enforce the eviction, the story broke. Naomi had sent it to every major news outlet, CNN, MSNBC, The Washington Post, and even grassroots activists on social media. Within hours, Summit Trust Bank foreclosure scandal was trending nationwide. Darren watched from his phone as the story spread like wildfire. The recording of Ethan Lancaster admitting to the fraud played in news segments. Judge Crawford's hidden financial ties were exposed in bold headlines. Whistleblowers from Summit Trust Bank began coming forward, confirming that minority homeowners were deliberately targeted for predatory foreclosure. The sheriff's deputies at Angela's home received urgent calls before they could remove a single box. They retreated, confused, before one of them finally turned to Angela. "Ma'am, we've been ordered to halt the eviction." Tears welled in Angela's eyes as she clutched her chest. Darren held her as the weight of the moment settled over them. They had won. For now. Later that evening, Darren and Naomi sat in a small cafe, their phones buzzing non-stop with updates. Lawsuits were being filed against Summit Trust Bank. Judge Crawford was under investigation. Lancaster and Harrington LLP was scrambling to save face. Naomi looked at Darren. "We did it." Darren let out a slow, relieved breath. "Yeah. But this isn't over. They won't go down without a fight." Naomi smirked. "Good. I'm not done exposing them." Darren chuckled, shaking his head. "You're insane." Naomi raised her coffee cup. "And you're reckless." But together, she clinked her mug against his. "We're unstoppable." The courtroom buzzed with a quiet but electric tension as Darren Cole took his seat at the defense table. His emergency motion had forced Judge William Crawford to hold another hearing, an opportunity to strike down the falsified evidence Summit Trust Bank had just introduced. But Darren knew this wasn't just about a legal motion. This was about survival. The doors swung open, and Ethan Lancaster strode in, his expression cold and composed, but Darren caught the tightness in his jaw. Lancaster knew the walls were closing in. The fabricated documents were a desperate move, a last-ditch attempt to shift the timeline and make the foreclosure appear legal. Darren's hands clenched around his pen as Judge Crawford entered, his robe swishing as he settled onto the bench. The usual air of arrogance clung to him, but something in his demeanor was different, subtler, more cautious. "Court is now in session," he said, his voice clipped. "Mr. Cole, you may proceed with your argument." Darren stood, heart hammering, but his voice was steady. "Your Honor, I am contesting the so-called new evidence submitted by Lancaster and Harrington LLP on behalf of Summit Trust Bank. These backdated payment notices are fraudulent, and I have concrete proof that they were fabricated after a federal investigation into this case began." The room stirred. The judge shifted uncomfortably. Across the aisle, Lancaster remained silent, though his fingers twitched against the table. Darren held up a printed email chain. This is an internal time-stamped email exchange between Summit Trust Bank executives, uncovered by an anonymous whistleblower. The email explicitly states, he glanced at the highlighted passage. Adjust documentation to reflect an earlier default date, make sure it looks legitimate before court review. A wave of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Darren continued, pressing the advantage. These emails were sent 3 days ago, after this court had already seen evidence proving that my mother, Angela Cole, was fully compliant with her payment plan. He turned to Judge Crawford, watching his expression tighten. Your Honor, this is deliberate fraud. If you allow this evidence, you are enabling perjury in your own courtroom. The tension thickened. Lancaster slowly rose, smoothing the front of his suit. Your Honor, the defense is making baseless accusations. That email chain is inadmissible without verification of its source. My clients maintain that. But he was cut off. The doors at the back of the courtroom burst open, and Detective Kevin Mitchell strode in, flanked by 2 federal agents in suits. Mitchell's badge flashed under the harsh fluorescent lights as he addressed the judge directly. Your Honor, Mitchell said, his voice firm and unwavering, the state attorney's office has been reviewing Summit Trust Bank's foreclosure practices. Late last night, we received a signed statement from a former bank employee, who confirmed that Ethan Lancaster personally approved the backdating of documents in multiple foreclosure cases, including this one. The room erupted in whispers. Judge Crawford went pale. This is highly irregular, he muttered, rubbing his temple. Mitchell wasn't finished. Additionally, he continued, his sharp gaze pinning Lancaster in place, we have an active federal warrant for the immediate arrest of Mr. Lancaster on charges of mortgage fraud, document falsification, and conspiracy to defraud homeowners. For the first time in weeks, Darren saw fear in Lancaster's eyes. The smug mask cracked, his fingers gripping the table's edge. This is ridiculous, Lancaster hissed. This is a politically motivated attack. I have every right to. You have the right to remain silent, one of the federal agents interjected as he stepped forward, producing handcuffs. Lancaster staggered back. Judge Crawford, you can't let this happen. This case is over, Mr. Lancaster. Judge Crawford's voice was tight with controlled panic. He looked at Darren, his expression unreadable, before clearing his throat. In light of this new information, the court has no choice but to dismiss Summit Trust Bank's claim against Angela Cole. Silence. Then, a rush of whispers. Darren's breath caught in his throat. His knees nearly buckled, but he forced himself to stand strong. The foreclosure was overturned. Angela Cole was safe. The sheriff's department would not be evicting her from her home. For the first time in weeks, Darren had won. The gavel struck. This hearing is adjourned, Judge Crawford muttered, barely hiding the fury behind his forced neutrality. The federal agents grabbed Lancaster, locking his wrists in cuffs as reporters scrambled to snap photos. Darren met Lancaster's eyes one final time. He was done. But Darren knew. This war wasn't over. That night, Darren and Naomi sat in a hotel room outside of Brookdale, watching the breaking news unfold. The headline across the screen read, Summit Trust Bank executives and attorneys under investigation for massive foreclosure fraud scheme. Beneath it, Lancaster's mugshot flashed, along with the names of several Summit Trust Bank officials who had also been indicted. Naomi let out a slow breath. It's happening, she whispered. This is bigger than just us now. Darren exhaled, his fingers twitching against the hotel bedspread. Yeah. But Crawford is still out there. He tried to play it neutral in court, but he was in on this. He protected Lancaster for years. The feds need to go after him next. Naomi nodded. They will. Once Lancaster starts talking, Crawford will be next in line. Darren wasn't sure whether Lancaster would turn on his old allies, but he did know one thing. The system had finally been forced to look at itself. And it was crumbling. The next morning, Darren's phone buzzed. A new email. Subject: Law School Acceptance. His breath caught. Hands trembling, he clicked it open. Dear Mr. Cole, we are pleased to inform you that you have been accepted into Brookdale State Law School. Your passion for justice and your demonstrated commitment to legal advocacy make you an ideal candidate. We look forward to welcoming you. Darren's vision blurred as he read the words over again. Naomi glanced at him, confused. Darren? He turned the phone toward her. Her mouth fell open. You got in. Darren let out a small, stunned laugh. I got in. Brookdale State Law, the place he had once abandoned to care for his mother. He wasn't just winning a battle anymore. He was shaping his future. Naomi grinned, nudging him. Looks like the system just made its worst mistake. It let you through the door. Darren chuckled, his chest finally feeling light. Yeah, he said, exhaling. Now let's burn it down from the inside. The morning sun spilled through the hotel window, casting long shadows across the small room where Darren Cole sat, his mind racing. The news of his acceptance to Brookdale State Law School still felt surreal, like something from a life he had almost forgotten. Naomi Brooks sat across from him, sipping coffee, her laptop open as she scrolled through article updates. The public outcry was growing. Protesters gathered outside Summit Trust Bank's headquarters. Community leaders were demanding deeper investigations into foreclosure cases stretching back more than a decade. The system wasn't just cracking. It was breaking apart. You're still thinking about Crawford, Naomi said, not looking up from her screen. Darren nodded slowly. He's the last piece. Lancaster might be behind bars, but Judge William Crawford was the one who let this happen. He blocked evidence, dismissed cases. How many families did he destroy just to protect his friends at Summit Trust? Naomi closed her laptop. You think he'll be next? Darren's jaw clenched. If there's any justice left, yeah. He wanted to believe that. Wanted to believe that the system would hold itself accountable. But he had seen how power protected itself, how men like Crawford always seemed to walk away untouched. Not this time. By midday, Darren's phone buzzed again. Detective Kevin Mitchell. Mr. Cole, the investigator greeted, his voice heavy. I wanted to give you a heads up before this hits the press. Darren sat up straight. What is it? There was a pause. Then, we arrested Judge Crawford this morning. Naomi's head snapped toward Darren as he put the call on speaker. Obstruction of justice, conspiracy, fraud, Mitchell continued. Lancaster folded. He gave us everything. Emails, recorded calls, even wire transfers. Turns out, Summit Trust wasn't just rewarding Crawford with favors. They were paying him directly. Darren exhaled sharply, relief flooding his chest. They got him, Naomi whispered. They got him, Darren echoed. Thought you'd want to know, Mitchell added. Oh, and one more thing. You might want to watch the news in about an hour. I think you'll like what you see. Darren didn't need to wait. His phone was already buzzing with breaking news alerts. Brookdale County Judge William Crawford indicted in federal corruption probe. A photo of Crawford, looking ashen-faced and defeated, flashed across the screen. Darren let out a low, stunned chuckle. He had won. Not just the case. Not just his mother's home. But a fight that should have been impossible. That evening, Darren and Naomi sat outside on the hood of her rented car, watching the lights of Brookdale flicker in the distance. It had been his battlefield, but for the first time in months, it felt like his home again. Naomi nudged him. So, law school. How's it feel knowing you're going from fighting the system to officially becoming part of it? Darren smirked. Feels like they made a mistake letting me in, Naomi laughed. Their worst mistake. He exhaled, glancing at the acceptance letter on his phone screen once more. "It's funny," he murmured. "For so long, I thought the system was unshakable. That no matter how hard I fought, people like me couldn't win." Naomi's expression softened. And now? Darren looked out at the city. Now, he saw something different. Not a system that was invincible. Not a system that couldn't be changed. But a system that was crumbling under the weight of its own corruption, and he was holding the wrecking ball. "This fight isn't over," Darren said. "Summit Trust isn't the only bank that's done this. Crawford isn't the only judge who's dirty." He turned to Naomi. "You still want to burn this thing down?" Naomi smirked. "You already know the answer." Darren grinned, feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. As they sat beneath the night sky, a new battle was already on the horizon. But this time, Darren wasn't just fighting to survive. He was fighting to change everything.